The gavel came down hard, sharp enough to split the smoke-heavy air inside the silver ember. Men pressed shoulder to shoulder, breath thick with whiskey and hunger. On the small platform near the wall stood a girl barefoot on warped boards, her white dress clinging to her like a last defense. She held herself still, though her hands trembled. When she lifted her eyes, the room quieted, as if shame itself was listening. Lila Rowan didn't cry. She had done that in the dark, alone. Now she simply breathed, shallow and steady, trying to keep the fear from showing in her throat. The saloon lamps threw long yellow drops across her skin, and the heat made the room restless. Caro Tate, broad shoulders, slick smile, leaned an elbow on the counter and lifted the gavel again. "Gentlemen," he drawled, "you're looking at the last pure thing left in Thorn Creek." Someone laughed. Someone else spat. But no one looked away. Lila did. In a blink of memory, she saw her father's hands, stained with ink, washing them in the creek behind their cabin. She saw the ledger he refused to sign. She saw the fear in his eyes the night before he died. The picture flashed and vanished, leaving only the truth she had carried silently. He hadn't owed a dime. He had been murdered for saying no. Caro raised his chin, pleased at the tension. "We'll start at 50. Voices rose at once. 50, 60, 70, the numbers falling like stones into a well. Lila tightened her fingers until they ached. A fly circled her cheek. She didn't flinch. 100, someone shouted. Her breath snagged, not from the number, but from the sight beyond the swinging doors. A strip of daylight cut across the floor, widening as the doors were pushed open. Boots stepped through, dusty, worn, silent. A tall man stood framed in the light, hat low over his brow, coat hanging heavy with road dust. Ezekiel Cole didn't speak at first. He just looked at the girl on the platform, his jaw working once, faintly, like something old inside him had shifted. The crowd turned toward him, muttering. Caro narrowed his eyes. "Well now," Caro said, "look what the desert rolled in." Ezekiel walked in slow, steady, as if the air carried weight. The sound of his boots against the wood was the only honest thing in the room. He reached the bar but didn't sit, didn't blink. His gaze stayed on Lila, and something in his face, exhaustion, regret, made her shoulders soften a fraction. Caro tapped the gavel. 150. Do I hear? 300. The words dropped like a hammer. The whole saloon snapped quiet. Someone choked on his drink. Someone swore under his breath. Even Lila blinked, unsure she heard right. Caro let out a laugh, thin and sharp. Mighty big bid for a man who keeps to himself. Ezekiel didn't answer. He reached into his coat, pulled out a roll of bills tied with twine, and laid it on the counter. His hand shook once, just once, but he steadied it. Lila swallowed hard. Her voice barely came out. Why would you do that? He didn't look at her, not yet. Because I was too late once, he said softly. And I'll not be late again. Caro pushed off the bar. Now hold on. Ezekiel's hand went to his holster, slow but certain. The room held its breath. Men shifted, uncertain. Lila felt her pulse in her palms. Something unspoken passed between the two men, a current of warning. Caro tilted his head. Think you can walk her out of here? Silence. Then Ezekiel's eyes cut through the smoke, sharp and unblinking. I didn't come here to think. He stepped toward the platform. Lila's knees loosened beneath her. She had stood alone for so long she almost forgot what it felt like when someone stepped forward instead of away. The saloon doors creaked as a gust of dry wind pushed them inward, scattering dust across the floor. For a moment, every man looked up. Ezekiel reached for Lila's arm, and from behind them, Caro whispered, low and poisonous, "Walk out that door, Cole, and I promise you won't get far." Lila stiffened. Ezekiel froze. The room went still as gunmetal. The gavel came down hard, sharp enough to split the smoke-heavy air inside the silver ember. Men pressed shoulder to shoulder, breath thick with whiskey and hunger. On the small platform near the wall stood a girl barefoot on warped boards, her white dress clinging to her like a last defense. She held herself still, though her hands trembled. When she lifted her eyes, the room quieted, as if shame itself was listening. Lila Rowan didn't cry. She had done that in the dark, alone. Now she simply breathed, shallow and steady, trying to keep the fear from showing in her throat. The saloon lamps threw long yellow drops across her skin, and the heat made the room restless. Caro Tate, broad shoulders, slick smile, leaned an elbow on the counter and lifted the gavel again. "Gentlemen," he drawled, "you're looking at the last pure thing left in Thorn Creek." Someone laughed. Someone else spat. But no one looked away. Lila did. In a blink of memory, she saw her father's hands, stained with ink, washing them in the creek behind their cabin. She saw the ledger he refused to sign. She saw the fear in his eyes the night before he died. The picture flashed and vanished, leaving only the truth she had carried silently. He hadn't owed a dime. He had been murdered for saying no. Caro raised his chin, pleased at the tension. "We'll start at 50. Voices rose at once. 50, 60, 70, the numbers falling like stones into a well. Lila tightened her fingers until they ached. A fly circled her cheek. She didn't flinch. 100, someone shouted. Her breath snagged, not from the number, but from the sight beyond the swinging doors. A strip of daylight cut across the floor, widening as the doors were pushed open. Boots stepped through, dusty, worn, silent. A tall man stood framed in the light, hat low over his brow, coat hanging heavy with road dust. Ezekiel Cole didn't speak at first. He just looked at the girl on the platform, his jaw working once, faintly, like something old inside him had shifted. The crowd turned toward him, muttering. Caro narrowed his eyes. "Well now," Caro said, "look what the desert rolled in." Ezekiel walked in slow, steady, as if the air carried weight. The sound of his boots against the wood was the only honest thing in the room. He reached the bar but didn't sit, didn't blink. His gaze stayed on Lila, and something in his face, exhaustion, regret, made her shoulders soften a fraction. Caro tapped the gavel. 150. Do I hear? 300. The words dropped like a hammer. The whole saloon snapped quiet. Someone choked on his drink. Someone swore under his breath. Even Lila blinked, unsure she heard right. Caro let out a laugh, thin and sharp. Mighty big bid for a man who keeps to himself. Ezekiel didn't answer. He reached into his coat, pulled out a roll of bills tied with twine, and laid it on the counter. His hand shook once, just once, but he steadied it. Lila swallowed hard. Her voice barely came out. Why would you do that? He didn't look at her, not yet. Because I was too late once, he said softly. And I'll not be late again. Caro pushed off the bar. Now hold on. Ezekiel's hand went to his holster, slow but certain. The room held its breath. Men shifted, uncertain. Lila felt her pulse in her palms. Something unspoken passed between the two men, a current of warning. Caro tilted his head. Think you can walk her out of here? Silence. Then Ezekiel's eyes cut through the smoke, sharp and unblinking. I didn't come here to think. He stepped toward the platform. Lila's knees loosened beneath her. She had stood alone for so long she almost forgot what it felt like when someone stepped forward instead of away. The saloon doors creaked as a gust of dry wind pushed them inward, scattering dust across the floor. For a moment, every man looked up. Ezekiel reached for Lila's arm, and from behind them, Caro whispered, low and poisonous, Walk out that door, Cole, and I promise you won't get far. Lila stiffened. Ezekiel froze. The room went still as gunmetal. The street outside the silver ember felt too bright, too still, like the whole town had stepped back from its own shadow. Ezekiel kept his body angled in front of Lila as they moved down the porch steps, his hand resting light but ready near his holster. Dust drifted in thin spirals, catching glints of sun from shuttered windows. Thorn Creek watched them the way a wolf watches something it doesn't understand yet. Lila pulled Ezekiel's coat tighter around her. The air tasted like metal and heat. Her feet were bare, but she didn't feel the boards or the dirt, only the trembling inside her ribs. She tried not to look back. She failed. Caro still stood on the saloon porch, smiling as if he already knew how this day would end. Ezekiel didn't turn around. Keep walking. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried enough certainty to push her legs forward. The sun pressed down like a hand, and the silence between buildings felt wrong, heavy, stretched too thin over something mean. Lila kept her eyes on the ground. Everyone's hiding, she whispered. They're scared, Ezekiel said. Fear makes folks close doors faster than they open them. Scared of Caro? And of themselves? That answer hurt more than she expected. She swallowed the tightness in her throat. Then, what are you? His jaw worked once. Tired of running. They passed the mercantile, then the telegraph office. Curtains shifted. Boots creaked on floorboards behind walls. Lila felt them watching, not out of care but curiosity, the kind that comes right before judgment. Ezekiel slowed. His eyes narrowed at something ahead. She followed his gaze. Sheriff Dempsey stood outside the telegraph office, hat low, badge catching a sliver of light. The man spat in the dust, wiped his mouth with the back of his hand, and turned his face away. He didn't nod, didn't offer help, didn't even look at Ezekiel full on. Just stepped aside like a man who had already chosen who he was willing to stand against. Lila's voice shook. He won't stop them? He ain't stopped Caro in 5 years, Ezekiel said. Why would he start now? They kept moving. Lila's legs wobbled but held. Ezekiel walked just close enough that she could feel the steadiness of him. Quiet, grounded, worn, but unbroken. She could not remember the last time someone made room for her in the world. Her breath caught. She didn't know if it was gratitude or fear. A door opened somewhere down the street. An older woman peeked out, eyes softening when they met Lila's. She almost stepped forward. Almost. But the moment she noticed Caro's men at the far end of the street, her door shut quick, the latch clicking hard. Lila didn't blame her. She only felt the sting of being left alone again. Ezekiel noticed. Don't take it to heart, he said quietly. Good folk make bad choices when their lives depend on it. She looked up at him. Does yours? He didn't answer. Maybe he didn't know. The heat shimmered off the dirt road. Lila's head throbbed. Her vision blurred at the edges. She tried to steady her breathing, but a wave of lightheadedness swept over her, and she grabbed Ezekiel's sleeve. He caught her before she stumbled. Hey, easy now. I'm fine, she whispered, though her knees said otherwise. You're exhausted. Ain't shameful to admit it. She blinked against the sunlight, trying to focus on his face. Strong lines, tired eyes, a gentleness he seemed to carry like a burden. No man had ever looked at her like she was, something worth saving. A gust of hot wind swept down the street, rattling loose shutters. Lila flinched as dust blew into her eyes. Ezekiel shielded her with his body, hand on her shoulder. Almost out of town, he murmured. But before they reached the livery, a sound cracked through the silence. Boy! It wasn't a cry of fear, just the raw, breathless joy of a child. Ezekiel froze. Lila turned with him. A small figure sprinted down the road, bare feet kicking up dust, braid bouncing behind her. Jonah's face was flushed, eyes bright with relief and excitement. But Lila saw what Jonah didn't, the shadow moving by the livery roofline, a glint of metal, a hand resting too calmly on a gun belt. Her heart lurched. Ezekiel. He saw it too. His entire body tensed, one hand reaching instinctively toward Jonah, the other going to his holster. Jonah, stop! The girl kept running, laughter cutting through the heat. A man stepped out from the shade near the horses. Caro's man, boots angled, thumb brushing the hammer of his revolver. The street tightened into a tunnel. Dust rose, Sun hammered down. Every window seemed to hold its breath. Lila grabbed Ezekiel's arm, her voice breaking. "She doesn't see him." "I know," he said. His hand hovered over his gun. The man near the livery smiled. Jonah kept running, and the world narrowed to one impossible choice. Jonah didn't hear the danger in her father's voice. She only saw him, tall, dusty, safe, and she ran harder, arms wide, sunlight catching the grin on her small face. Ezekiel's breath locked in his chest. The world shrank to the space between the child's feet and the man waiting with his hand on a gun. "Jonah, stop!" he called again, louder this time. The girl stumbled for half a second, confused by the sharpness in his tone. That hesitation saved her life. The gunman tensed, shifting his weight. Ezekiel drew in one clean motion. No thought, no mercy, just instinct born from years of losing too much. A single shot ripped the silence. Dust burst at Jonah's heel. She shrieked and fell to her knees. Ezekiel fired back before the man could correct his aim. The bullet struck the post beside the gunman's head, splintering wood. Men cursed from the saloon porch. Someone ducked. Someone else ran. The street came alive with panic. Ezekiel was already moving, boots pounding the dirt, Lila right behind him though her legs shook. Jonah scrambled up, crying now, hands pressed to her ears. Ezekiel swept her into his arms, checking her for blood, touching her face, her shoulders, her tiny ribs. "You hurt? Tell me where it hurts." She sobbed into his shirt, breath hitching, chest trembling. I couldn't breathe, Papa." He lifted her chin. "Look at me." Her lips trembled. "My chest's tight." He cursed under his breath and reached inside his coat. Lila recognized the small brass and glass inhaler even before he opened it. The same kind her father had used on sick calves. The same kind he had repaired for poor families. Ezekiel pressed it to Jonah's lips. "Slow. Breathe in, that's it." The little girl inhaled, trembling. A thin wheeze dragged through the chamber. Her breath steadied, barely, but steadied enough, rate slow. Lila knelt beside them, one hand hovering close to Jonah, but afraid to touch. "She's so small," she whispered. "Too small for this." Ezekiel swallowed hard. "I know." Jonah clung to his shirt, eyes swollen with fear. "He aimed at me, Papa." Ezekiel brushed her hair back. "He won't again." Lila felt something tear inside her, a tenderness she didn't expect, a fear she didn't want. And beneath both, anger, burning, rising, born from seeing a child hunted like an animal. "We need to move," she whispered. "Caro's men won't wait long." Ezekiel nodded, lifting Jonah higher. "Hold tight." She wrapped her arms around his neck. He stood, muscles taut, breath ragged with a fury he kept buried under years of silence. At the far end of the street, Caro stepped out of the saloon, clapping slow. The sound echoed like a mockery. "Fine shot, Cole. Shame it didn't finish the job." Lila rose to her feet, fists clenched. "That was a child." Caro tilted his head. You're worth more when folks around you break. Makes you easier to guide. Ezekiel's voice dropped to something darker than anger. You lay a hand on her again, and I swear. You swear? Caro laughed. You ain't got nothing left to bargain with. But Lila saw something flicker across the man's face. Not fear, calculation, uncertainty. Because the street had heard that shot. Because shutters cracked open. Because even cowards hated the sight of a child almost dying. Caro clicked his tongue, annoyed. This ain't finished. Not by a long mile, he gestured subtly, and two men began moving along the rooftops. Ezekiel caught it instantly. We're leaving, now. They rushed toward the livery, boots kicking up pale dust. Jonah clung to him, breathing shallow, coughing. Lila ran close, her heart pounding with each uneven breath the child took. Papa, Jonah gasped. I can't. You can, he murmured. I've got you. At the livery door, he set her gently on her feet. She swayed. Lila steadied her with a hand on her shoulder. For a moment, Jonah leaned into the touch, a fragile trust forming, trembling like a newborn foal. Lila swallowed hard. Ezekiel, she won't make it far if we stay in the open. I know. He saddled the bay mare with quick, practiced movements. Up with her. Lila lifted Jonah carefully, settling her in front. Ezekiel mounted behind them, arms braced around both to keep them steady. He looked at Lila, just looked, and in that moment, she understood something wordless. He wasn't saving her alone. He was saving everyone he refused to lose again. They turned the horse toward the open road, but before they moved, Caro's voice drifted on the rising wind. You can run, Cole, but Thorn Creek remembers every debt. Ezekiel didn't look back, but the look in his eyes told Lila one simple truth. This wasn't escape. It was the beginning of a war he didn't want, but would fight for them. The road out of Thorn Creek stretched long and empty, a ribbon of pale dust cutting toward the Dry Fork Ridge. Ezekiel held the reins with one hand and kept the other braced around Jonah's waist. Lila rode beside him on a smaller chestnut mare borrowed from the livery, the animal skittish under her trembling grip. The wind carried a faint metallic tang, sharper than the usual desert breath. They didn't speak for a while. Words felt too heavy, too breakable. The hooves of the horses made their own rhythm, steady, patient, the sound of people trying to outrun something that wanted to cling to their heels. Jonah leaned back slightly, resting against Ezekiel's chest. Her breathing was shallow but steady. Papa, we're really leaving? We are, he said, voice low. Just till things cool. Lila glanced at him. You don't believe that. This won't cool. Ezekiel didn't deny it. No, it won't. The truth sat between them, raw and unpolished. Lila looked ahead again, watching the heat shimmer over the road. She tried to steady her thoughts, but her mind drifted back to her father. His voice, the weight of his hand on her shoulder, the way he refused to sign what wasn't true. Caro killed him for that. Her jaw tightened. She didn't let the tears come. Tears were for places far from men like Caro. Jonah shifted in the saddle. Lila? Yes, sweetheart? Back at the saloon. Were you scared? Lila hesitated. She didn't want to lie. Yes, very scared. But you didn't cry. Sometimes crying doesn't help, she whispered. Jonah nodded, thinking hard. Papa doesn't cry either. Rate slow. Ezekiel let out a long breath, one Lila could hear more than see. Some things we carry quiet, he murmured. Lila studied him for a moment. The tired lines around his eyes, the set of his shoulders, the tenderness in the way he held Jonah, tight enough to protect, loose enough not to cage. The wind shifted. A sudden gust swept across the plain, carrying grains of dust that stung their cheeks. The horses tossed their heads. Ezekiel felt the change in the air first. He slowed their pace, scanning the horizon. Wind's wrong. How wrong? Lila asked. Dry Fork don't blow this way unless something's off. He looked toward the ridge. Feels driven, like something's pushing it. Lila's pulse quickened. Caro? Maybe. Or maybe just the land warning us. She didn't know which scared her more. The sky stayed clear, but the wind grew harsher, whistling low like a warning whispered through teeth. Sparse bushes rattled. Dust rolled in thin sheets over the ground. Jonah clung tighter. Papa, the air hurts my nose. I know, baby. He adjusted the scarf around her neck. We'll slow a bit. They eased into a careful trot. Lila rubbed her fingers along the mare's neck, calming the animal's nerves with soft murmurs. The motion steadied her, gave her something to hold besides fear. Ezekiel glanced back toward the town. We bought ourselves minutes, not hours. Caro will follow, she said softly. He already has. They rode on. The road began to rise slightly as they approached the first break of rock before the Dry Fork Pass. Shadows crawled along the edges, thin and sharp. The wind howled once, short, sudden, unnatural. Lila shivered. The closer they came to the hills, the more she felt something building in the air, a pressure like the desert holding its breath. Ezekiel, she said quietly, it's too strong. Wind doesn't turn like that unless... He finished for her. Unless someone's opening the damn vents. Her stomach dropped. Why would anyone do that? To force us into the pass. He met her eyes. A choke point. A trap. The word didn't need to be spoken. Lila felt the world tilt for a second. Not from fear, from the realization that Caro wasn't acting out of rage or impulse. He was planning this, pushing them, herding them like cattle. Ezekiel looked at the sky again, reading it the way other men read scripture. We need to reach the first overhang, shelter from the worst of it. Lila nodded and urged her mare closer to Jonah, reaching out to brush the girl's arm. You hold on to him, all right? Jonah nodded, silent now, sensing what adults wouldn't say. The wind rose again, harder, sharper, a blade instead of a breeze. Dust lashed sideways. The horses balked. Lila coughed against the grit. Ezekiel leaned forward, voice a rough growl against the storm forming in the distance. "We're moving faster." And with a snap of the reins, he drove their horses toward the narrowing mouth of the Dry Fork Ridge, the wind biting at their backs like something alone. Behind them, carried on the rising gust, Lila thought she heard a faint, distant shout. Then another. Then the unmistakable echo of hooves, many of them closing in. Her heart seized. "They're coming," she whispered, and the storm answered for them, rolling across the land like a curtain of red. The first wave of dust hit like a thrown fist. It slapped across Ezekiel's cheek, tore at Lila's hair, scraped Jonah's skin raw. The horses panicked, hooves dancing against the hard-packed ground. Ezekiel tightened his grip on the reins, voice steady even as the wind roared. "Head low," he called. "Cover your faces." The sky, once a pale blue, darkened into a boiling red haze. Dust spiraled upward, twisting like a living thing. The heat changed too, shifting from dry warmth to a suffocating, breath-stealing furnace. Lila pressed her sleeve to Jonah's nose, shielding her small face from the grit. Jonah coughed, voice thin. "Papa, I can't see." "I've got you," Ezekiel said, pulling her closer against his chest. His arm locked around her, solid as a wall. Lila forced her mare forward, inching toward him. The storm swallowed the world so quickly she could barely make out the outline of his shoulders. She reached for his stirrup, using it to steady herself. The mare squealed, terrified. "Stay with me!" Ezekiel shouted through the wind. "I'm trying!" The storm didn't howl. It screamed, high and wild, like the old stories of the desert spirits. Sand tore across their coats, stinging their eyes, filling their mouths with the taste of rust. Then came the second wave. A wall of red dust slammed across the pass, pushing them sideways. Lila nearly fell. Ezekiel leaned off the saddle, catching her by the arm just long enough for her to regain balance. They pressed toward a jagged overhang ahead, a wedge of rock jutting from the ridge wall. It wasn't shelter, not really, but it was all they had. As they fought toward it, Lila choked out, "This isn't natural." Ezekiel didn't answer at first. He couldn't. The wind swallowed everything. But when he did speak, his voice was ragged, raw with anger. He opened the vents. "What?" "Caro. The wind tunnels along Dry Fork. He opened them to drive the storm right into this canyon." Lila stared into the swirling red. Her heartbeat hammered. Caro hadn't just chased them. He had built the storm around them. A trap made of dust and wind. Her stomach tightened, not in fear, but in fury so sharp it felt like it cut her from the inside. The horses stumbled under the force of the gale. Ezekiel swung off his saddle, boots thudding into the sand. He lifted Jonah down, shielding her with his coat, and motioned Lila toward the overhang. "Get low," he shouted. Lila slid off her mare, knees buckling when her feet hit the ground. She grabbed Jonah into her arms, holding the child close. Ezekiel pressed against them, forming a barrier with his body as the worst of the storm slammed across them. The dust stung every inch of exposed skin. It hissed around the rocks, filling the air with a sound like a rattle. Jonah whimpered, "Papa, it hurts." I know, baby, I know. Ezekiel cupped her head against his chest. Lila felt him shake, not from fear, but from the weight of trying to shield both of them. She pressed her shoulder into his, sharing what little strength she had. Minutes felt like hours as the storm tore at them. Then, thin at first, then louder, the sound of voices seeped through the roar. Men shouting, hooves struggling against the wind, shapes flickered in the red fog. They followed us, Lila whispered, throat raw. Ezekiel shifted to see through the swirling dust. Caro's men won't stop in this storm. They'll get caught in it too. They'd sooner die than go back without us. Time 500 mems. The wind shrieked again. A shadow rose on the ridge above, tall, wavering, rifle glinting briefly through the red haze. Lila's pulse hammered. Someone's up there. Ezekiel squinted into the storm. They took the high ground. Why shoot in a storm like this? They'll miss. They ain't looking to shoot. Ezekiel swallowed hard. They're tracking where we run so they can trap us once this thing breaks. Lila held Jonah tighter, dust grinding into her teeth, into her hair, into her heartbeat. The storm roared so loud it drowned her thoughts. Another blast of wind hit them, harder than before, forcing all three flat against the dirt. Ezekiel grit his teeth. This storm ain't done with us yet. Lila's eyes widened as she lifted her head just enough to see through the thinned veil of dust. For a breath, a single shattering breath, she saw it. A silhouette on the ridge, rifle raised, staring down directly at them. Not shooting, watching, waiting. Her stomach turned cold. They're hunting us in the storm, she whispered. And then the wind screamed again, swallowing sight, sound, and light in a red, furious wave. The storm eased the way a wounded animal quiets, slow, trembling, dangerous in its silence. Dust settled into a red veil over the canyon floor. The air tasted of grit and copper. Lila lifted her head first, blinking through the sting in her eyes. Jonah lay curled between them, face buried in Ezekiel's coat. The child's breath came rough but steady. Lila brushed the dust from her cheek with gentle fingers. She's all right, she whispered. Ezekiel nodded once. For now. His voice was low, scraped raw by sand and fear. He pushed himself upright, scanning the ridge walls. Shadows moved along the rocks. 2, maybe 3 shapes, slipping behind boulders, rifles slung low. They weren't rushing. They were closing in. He clenched his jaw. They waited out the worst of it. Lila followed his gaze, heart pounding. They mean to trap us here. Yeah, this canyon's a funnel. No way out but forward or back. Both directions felt like a dead end. Ezekiel rose slowly, testing the weight in his legs. Dust flaked from his coat as he stood over them like a shield carved out of exhaustion and grit. Lila could see the frustration in the tightness of his shoulders. He'd dragged them through hell only to land in a narrower one. She lifted Jonah into her arms, the child clinging to her neck. What now? We move quiet. Stay low. He pointed toward a break in the canyon wall, barely more than a sliver between two leaning boulders. There, that's our only cover. Lila followed him, feet sinking into loose red sand. The horses had bolted during the storm, their hoofprints scattered uselessly down the canyon. Jonah trembled in Lila's arms, coughing when dust caught her throat. Ezekiel slowed his steps and glanced back. "Give her here." Lila hesitated. Jonah's small arms tightened around her, but she gently transferred the child into Ezekiel's hold. Jonah relaxed almost instantly, her cheek pressing into his chest. Something in Lila softened at the sight. Ezekiel crouched behind a boulder, motioning Lila to slide in beside him. The space was narrow, barely enough to breathe, but it hid them from the ridgeline above. For a moment, none of them spoke. They could hear small rocks skittering as men repositioned along the canyon walls. The sound scraped at Lila's nerves, each tap like a countdown. Ezekiel set Jonah down gently and leaned close to Lila. His voice was barely a breath. "They'll flank us." "How many?" "Don't know. Enough." He paused. "Caro's not with him. He's smarter than to ride into the storm. But he sent men who don't mind dying for $1. Lila drew in a shaky breath. "They think I'm worth that much?" His eyes met hers, dark, steady, tired. "Caro thinks control is." A heavy silence settled between them. Lila bit her lip, then whispered, "Ezekiel, there's something I should have told you." "Not now." "It matters," she insisted. His jaw tightened, but he nodded for her to go on. She swallowed dust. "Those men, they're not loyal to Caro. Not really. He cheats them, cuts their pay, takes a share of every job they do." Ezekiel stared at her, surprise flickering in his eyes. "You know that how?" "From when he forced Daddy to open his books." Her voice cracked. "I saw the scripts. They were fake. All of them." Ezekiel cursed under his breath. "Why didn't you say earlier?" "Because I didn't know if you'd believe me." Tears welled but didn't fall. No one ever did. He looked away, regret spreading across his features. "I believe you." The words hit her harder than the storm. A clatter echoed from the ridge above. Men shouted to each other, voices muffled by dust but growing closer. Ezekiel shifted, reaching for his holster. Lila grabbed his wrist. "Wait." He frowned. "We don't have time." She moved past him, standing just enough to be seen from the waist up. Ezekiel hissed her name, trying to pull her down, but she shook free. Her voice broke through the canyon like a crack of lightning. "Caro's robbing you! All of you!" The shadows on the ridge paused. Lila lifted her chin. "I saw his books. He's been skimming your shares every damn month." Silence fell, sharp, cold, dangerous. Ezekiel pulled her gently but firmly back behind the rock. "What are you doing?" "What I have to." She met his eyes. "If they doubt him, even for a moment, that's a way out. Or it gets you shot. Then we take that chance." He stared at her for a long, heavy second. Something changed in his expression. A recognition, maybe. or a fear deeper than the gunmen above. Then, a rifle hammer clicked. A single man stepped out from the ridge, crouched low. He raised his barrel, aimed straight at Lila. Jonah whimpered. Ezekiel shifted to fire, but it was too late. The man squeezed the trigger. The shot cracked through the canyon, sharp, final, merciless. Lila flinched, bracing for pain, but none came. A second sound followed, metal hitting stone. The rifleman's bullet struck the rock inches from her shoulder, sending red dust spraying across her face. Before she could draw breath, Ezekiel seized her arm and yanked her back behind the boulder. "You don't step out like that again," he growled, voice low and shaking. Lila stared at him, stunned. "But they heard me." He leaned close, eyes burning. "I almost lost you." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. They curled tight around her chest, stealing her breath more than the dust had. Above them, the canyon shifted with muted movement, boots scraping rock, men whispering to each other. Not rushing, not firing again, but listening. Lila wiped dust from her lips. They hesitated. They didn't expect the truth. Ezekiel kept one arm braced in front of her, scanning the shadows. Jonah had curled into a tight ball, hands over her ears. Lila smoothed the girl's hair, whispering, "I'm here. You're safe." Jonah's breath shook, but she nodded. Ezekiel exhaled, long and slow. "We'll use that. Their doubt buys us seconds." Seconds, not minutes, not safety, just a brief pause on the edge of death. A voice echoed from above, rough, uncertain. "What's she talking about?" Then another, sharper. "Is she lying? Caro don't short us." Lila swallowed, heart hammering. She rose again, but slower this time, just enough for her voice to reach the ridge without showing herself. "He forged scripts," she shouted. "He kept half your share. My father knew. Caro killed him to hide it." Silence. A long, dangerous silence. Then, footsteps shifting. A man cursed. Another muttered something about, "Those books Caro keeps locked." Doubt was a crack, small but widening. Ezekiel gave her a look, half warning, half reluctant admiration. "You're playing with fire." "He already set the fire," she whispered. "I'm just turning it back on him." Jonah tugged weakly at Ezekiel's coat. "Papa, are they leaving?" He shook his head. "Not likely." Another voice rose above the ridge, louder now, rattled. "Caro said she owed him, said her old man took money and never paid." Lila stepped forward again, voice breaking with anger she'd carried too long. "My father never owed a penny. Caro forged his name, then killed him when he wouldn't sign." Something shifted up top, an emotional shift you feel before you hear. Someone spat. Someone else cursed under their breath. The men were no longer aligned. Their anger had turned, but not yet toward the right man. Ezekiel leaned close. "They're questioning him. That's something. It's not enough. No, but it's a start." He pulled Jonah into his arms and helped Lila move further along the narrow crevice. They climbed over broken stone, staying low, keeping to the shadows. The canyon walls closed tighter, the space thinning into a bend that led deeper into the pass. Lila paused, listening. Footsteps above, but slower now, confused. The men were talking over each other, whispers drifting down like dust caught in dying wind. Then, unmistakable, a shout. "She ain't lyin'. I seen them scripts once. Caro said it was an accountin' mistake." Another voice answered, angry. "He's been taken from us. All this time." Ezekiel's eyes flickered with something like hope. He's losing them. But the canyon wasn't done with them yet. A lone figure appeared on the ridge ahead, crouched against the fading storm. Not the reckless shooter from before. This one moved carefully, rifle gripped tight but pointed low. His silhouette was smaller, lighter on his feet. He called down quietly, "Girl." Lila stiffened. Ezekiel reached for his gun, but the man didn't lift his. "Girl," the figure said again, voice wavering. Tell me your father's name." She swallowed. "Edwin Rowan." A beat. Then the man bowed his head, shoulders sinking. "I knew him," he said. "Gave me water once when I was dying out at Broken Well." Lila's breath stilled. Ezekiel's brows drew tight. "What's your name?" The figure stepped into the light, his face young, too young for the rifle he carried. Dust streaked his cheek. Shame burned in his eyes. "Beck Nolan." Lila's chest tightened. Jonah peeked up from Ezekiel's arms. Beck spoke again, voice trembling with a truth he couldn't swallow anymore. "If Caro killed a man like Edwin Rowan," he paused, "then I ain't fightin' for the right side." Something heavy fell away in that moment. A stone in the wrong place finally rolling free. But then, another shout echoed through the ridge. A different man yelling Beck's name, calling him a traitor. Boots thundered on stone above them. Ezekiel's voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "They're turning on each other." Lila grabbed Jonah's hand, pulse racing. "What do we do? Time 500 malms." Ezekiel pulled them tight against the canyon wall. "We run," he said. "Now." Above them, Caro's men began to close in, divided, angry, unpredictable. A perfect storm of men and dust, and they were caught in the center of it. The sound of Beck Nolan's name being shouted echoed through the canyon like a shot. His gaze shifted upward, meeting the stares of men who once thought of him as one of their own. The rifle he carried felt heavier now, the weight of loyalty shifting in his hands. "Beck, you traitor!" The shout came again, closer this time. The voice was thick with fury, but there was a tremor in it too, uncertainty. Beck's hand tightened around the rifle, but he didn't raise it. His eyes flickered back to Lila, then to Ezekiel, his throat tight with the knowledge of what he had to do. "Caro's no man of honor," he said quietly, almost to himself. "He's built this place with blood, not trust." The men above had stopped moving, waiting. There was a moment's hesitation, the kind of pause you only get when a life is about to change forever. A moment to decide. What's it gonna be, Beck? You with us or against us? Another shout rang out, this one from higher up. Beck's jaw clenched. He looked back toward the ridge. He had known these men, rode with them, fought beside them. But that was before he understood how far Caro's lies stretched, before he knew that every favor had a price attached. Ezekiel shifted beside Lila, pulling Jonah closer. They were only a few yards from where the men were gathering, but they were still hidden in the shadows of the canyon wall. Beck looked at them, his eyes dark with something between regret and resolve. He stepped forward, the gravel crunching under his boots as he made the choice that would change everything. "I'm not fighting for Caro anymore," he said, his voice low and steady, yet loud enough for the men to hear. "He's been robbing you blind all this time. You think he's been building this place up for you? He's been taking what's yours." A ripple of shock ran through the group of men on the ridge, and for a brief moment, the air shifted. Doubt, like a disease, began to spread. One man, thinner than the rest, stepped forward. "You lie, Beck. You've always been a fool." Beck's eyes hardened. "Maybe I was, but not anymore. If you're with Caro, you're a part of the problem. I ain't gonna stand by and let him kill for his lies." There was a long silence. The only sound now was the wind, howling through the canyon, stirring the dust. And then, another voice. "You're making a big mistake, Beck." It was Royce Caro's voice, deep, cold, and unyielding. Ezekiel's hand moved instinctively to his holster. Lila's breath caught in her chest. She knew what was coming. She had seen men like Caro break others before, with nothing more than fear. Beck's hand tightened on the rifle again. "No," he said, turning toward the sound of Caro's voice. "The mistake was trusting a man like you." A gunshot rang out. It wasn't from Beck. The bullet hit the rock just beside him, sending fragments of stone flying. A moment later, 2 more shots rang out, this time from Beck. His rifle spit fire, and a man on the ridge staggered back, clutching his shoulder. "Get down!" Ezekiel barked, pulling Lila and Jonah behind the boulder. The air exploded with shouts. Gunfire rang out from above, echoing through the canyon walls. Beck's men were either retreating or taking cover, unsure whether to follow the man they had once trusted or to side with Caro. But Caro's voice had already started to rise again, louder now, furious. "Finish this, now!" he yelled, his voice full of venom. Lila's heart raced. Her hand tightened around Jonah's, feeling the warmth of the child against her. The realization that this was the point of no return. Ezekiel shifted behind the boulder, eyes darting, calculating. "Beck's bought us time, but it won't last long." Lila didn't speak. She didn't need to. They both knew what had to come next. Beck stood in the open, firing again, his aim steady. But he was outnumbered, and he knew it. The men on the ridge were closing in, their rifles trained on him now. Lila could see the sweat on his face, the way his chest heaved as he pushed forward. "Don't!" she called. But it was too late. Beck had already moved. He turned to them one last time. "Run," he said, his voice breaking. "Go now. You've got a chance. Take it." Before Lila could protest, before Ezekiel could speak, Beck dove into the line of fire again, drawing their attention. A sharp crack of gunfire rang out, and the world seemed to freeze. Beck collapsed to the dirt, his rifle slipping from his fingers, but his eyes were wide, filled with something that wasn't fear. It was defiance. Lila turned away, clutching Jonah tighter to her chest as Ezekiel pulled her forward. "Now!" he commanded. But the shots were still echoing behind them. They weren't safe. Not yet. And as they moved, Lila could still hear Beck's name, whispered between the cracks in the dust. A sacrifice made too late, but one that had bought them another breath. The canyon's heat didn't let up. It clung to their skin like a vice, the dust swirling around them more alive than anything that had ever breathed on this land. Ezekiel kept them moving, but the weight of every step felt like a countdown. He could feel the gunmen closing in, their presence as constant as the air they were forced to breathe. Lila stayed close, her body pressed against his side, Jonah's small, trembling hand in hers. The child's weight was more than physical. It was the weight of everything Lila had fought for, everything Ezekiel had fought for. The ridge above them was lined with shadows, figures half seen through the haze of dust. The quiet was suffocating, broken only by the crunch of boots on gravel and the faint sound of shifting rocks. They weren't in a hurry. They didn't need to be. Ezekiel knew how this played out. Caro's men wouldn't rush. They'd take their time. Ezekiel's heart beat a slow rhythm against his chest, as if it too knew the truth. He couldn't protect them forever. Not like this. Lila's voice cut through the stillness, low but firm. We can't just keep running. He turned to her, his face grim. It's not about running. It's about buying time. For what? Ezekiel didn't answer. He didn't have a plan, not really. The canyon offered nothing but traps. If they kept going, they'd run out of room to maneuver. And if they turned back, they'd be staring straight into the barrels of guns. Then there was the weight he carried, the weight of his past, of the woman he had failed to protect, of the mistakes he had never been able to make right. And now, Lila and Jonah were paying the price for those mistakes. A sharp sound cut through the silence, rock scraping against boots. A figure emerged on the ridge, rifle in hand. He was taller than the others, his face shadowed but recognizable from the way he moved, the way he held his weapon. Caro's right-hand man. "Cole," the man called, his voice low, mocking. "Thought you'd be smarter than this." Ezekiel didn't flinch. He knew exactly who this was, Royce. Maddox. A man with more blood on his hands than most men would ever admit to. But Maddox wasn't here for blood. He was here for control. Lila stepped closer to Ezekiel, her voice barely a whisper. "What do we do now?" "We wait," Ezekiel said, his voice steady, though his hands tightened around his gun. "Wait for them to make their move." Maddox took another step forward, his boots crunching louder with each stride. "You really think you can outrun what's coming, Cole? You're just a damn fool if you think Caro won't have his say." "Caro's out of his mind if he thinks this is about me," Ezekiel said, keeping his eyes locked on Maddox. It's about her. The mention of Lila's name seemed to hit its mark. Maddox's eyes flickered, the arrogance draining from his face replaced by a flash of something darker. Lila Rowan, he spat, like the name was poison on his tongue. You think you can save her? She's just another piece of meat for Caro's game. You all are. Lila stiffened, her grip tightening on Jonah's hand. She could feel the weight of the words Maddox threw at her, the disgust, the contempt. It was a reminder of the price she'd been sold for, the price every woman like her had paid. Ezekiel didn't let his anger show. He couldn't. Not now. Caro's done, he said. This game ends today. Maddox chuckled, a dark, humorless sound. You think you can stop him? You think you're the hero in this story? Newsflash, Cole. Heroes die. Ezekiel's grip on the gun tightened, but he didn't draw it. Not yet. The air was too thick. Every movement felt like it would break the stillness, make them vulnerable. Maddox took another step forward. You can't save her. You can't save anyone. Lila stepped forward, suddenly feeling the fire that had been smoldering inside her for so long. I don't need saving, she said, her voice strong and unyielding. I've been saving myself since the day you tried to sell me. Maddox stopped, the words hanging between them like a whip waiting to crack. Ezekiel's eyes flickered to Lila, seeing the determination in her stance. For the first time since this nightmare started, he saw something else. The strength she'd been hiding all along. She wasn't waiting for someone to rescue her. She was ready to fight, to do whatever it took to survive. That realization hit him harder than anything else. She wasn't the only one who had been running. Maddox's face twisted into a sneer. You think you're the only one who has suffered? Caro owns this town. He owns you. No, Lila said, her voice rising. He doesn't. The silence that followed was thick and heavy. Then, without warning, Maddox jerked his rifle up, aiming directly at her. His finger was on the trigger. Ezekiel didn't think. He reacted. He moved between Lila and Maddox, his body taking the brunt of it. Ezekiel! Lila screamed. The shot rang out, a harsh, deafening sound, but it wasn't aimed at her. It hit Ezekiel in the shoulder, knocking him back against the rock. The pain was immediate, white-hot and sharp, but he didn't fall. Not yet. Lila screamed, rushing to his side, pulling him back into the safety of the boulder. Don't move, she shouted, tears stinging her eyes. You're bleeding. Ezekiel gritted his teeth, clutching his shoulder as he looked up at her. We keep moving, he said, his voice low and determined. We don't stop. But the world had already stopped. The choice had already been made. This wasn't about escaping anymore. It was about standing their ground. And the cost of standing was higher than they could have imagined. The world blurred into pain. Ezekiel's vision swam in and out of focus as he sank back against the cold rock, his breath ragged and shallow. His shoulder burned where the bullet had torn through, the blood soaking his coat. Every movement felt like dragging chains through mud. Lila's hands were frantic as she tried to stop the bleeding, but the blood kept coming, staining her fingers. Jonah's small voice broke through the haze, high-pitched with panic. "Papa! Papa, please!" Ezekiel reached for the boy, his hand shaking as it hovered near Jonah's face. "I'm all right," he rasped, the words thick with pain. Lila's hands shook as she pressed a cloth to the wound, trying to stop the bleeding. "You're not all right, Ezekiel. You're bleeding too much." "I said I'm all right," he growled, trying to push himself up, but the effort left him gasping for air. Lila's eyes flashed with frustration, but her voice was calm when she spoke. "You're not going anywhere until I get this under control." Ezekiel swallowed, feeling the weight of her words, the weight of everything. The canyon felt like it was closing in, the walls pressing down with a suffocating silence. The wind had died, and with it, the noise of their struggle. Caro's men were above them, waiting. They knew Ezekiel was wounded. They were waiting for the right moment to finish what they had started. Lila's hands were steady now, but her mind was anything but. She had seen enough men die in her life, too many who thought they could survive, too many who had fought the wrong battles. She wasn't going to lose Ezekiel like this, not after everything he'd done for her, for Jonah. "Stay with me, Ezekiel," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Please." Ezekiel's hand tightened on hers, his fingers cool and strong despite the blood that soaked his shirt. "I'll stay," he murmured, his voice rough. "I've come too far to die here." Lila glanced up, eyes searching the ridge. She could feel the tension in the air, like a storm was coming, but it hadn't broken yet. They couldn't wait any longer. They had to move. And then, just as her mind made up its decision, a shout echoed down from the ridge. "Cole, you there? Don't make this harder than it has to be." The voice was unmistakable. Caro's man, Royce Maddox. Lila's blood turned cold at the sound. She knew he wasn't done yet. He was circling them like a wolf waiting for the kill. "Lila," Ezekiel muttered, his voice laced with warning. "Get Jonah and move." "Not without you," she snapped, her eyes fierce with resolve. She reached for his gun, but Ezekiel stopped her with a shake of his head. "You won't need that. Not now." His eyes searched hers, a brief flicker of something like regret before it was replaced with something stronger. "You get him out of here. I'll cover you." Lila shook her head, her heart pounding in her chest. "I'm not leaving you, Ezekiel. Not now. Not when you've already done so much for us." Ezekiel closed his eyes for a moment, then nodded. "Then we fight." The decision was made. The last of their hope was wrapped in the cold steel of his revolver. But they didn't have time to waste. Lila took a deep breath. Her hands steady now, her fear buried deep inside. She looked at Jonah, who was still clinging to her side, his small body trembling. "We're going to get through this," she whispered to him, even though she wasn't sure she believed it herself. Jonah nodded, his face pale, but his eyes determined. He had seen too much death already, but something in him had changed. The innocence had been stripped away, replaced by a quiet courage. They moved fast. Ezekiel, despite his injury, forced himself to his feet, leaning heavily on the boulder for support. He drew his gun, eyes scanning the ridge. Lila had never seen him like this. So focused, so dangerous. The first shot rang out, echoing off the canyon walls. Ezekiel fired back, his bullet hitting the rock above them, sending a cloud of dust into the air. Time 500 mounds. He ducked low, pulling Lila and Jonah with him as more shots followed. Caro's men were closing in. "Take cover!" Ezekiel barked, and Lila pulled Jonah behind a large boulder. The boy was small enough to slip between the rocks easily, but it wouldn't be long before the men would find them. Lila's heart hammered in her chest, but she kept her breathing steady, her hand gripping the gun Ezekiel had given her. She was ready, ready to fight. Another shot rang out, this time too close. She could feel the wind of the bullet pass by her ear, and the sharp sting of fear cut through her. Ezekiel's voice broke through the noise. "Lila, get ready!" She nodded, her finger tightening on the trigger. The silence after the gunfire was like the calm before a storm. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Lila looked up, her eyes scanning the ridge. She could see movement above, men shifting into position. Maddox was up there, watching, waiting for his chance. And then, as the men began to take their positions, Lila saw something. A figure. Familiar, yet not. Beck Nolan. He stepped into view, rifle aimed and ready. For a moment, everything stopped. The world seemed to hold its breath. Ezekiel froze. "Beck," he whispered, disbelief in his voice. Beck didn't hesitate. He fired, his shot taking down one of Caro's men before they could react. Lila's heart skipped a beat. Beck turned to them, his face grim but resolute. "You don't have to fight this alone, Cole." Ezekiel's face softened, but only for a moment. "You should have stayed back, Beck." "I couldn't. Not after what Caro did," Beck said, his voice steady, unwavering. "We're in this together now." Lila's breath caught in her throat as she watched Beck take position beside Ezekiel, his rifle steady as he prepared to cover their retreat. For the first time since this nightmare started, Lila felt something like hope, a fragile thing, but it was there. And for a moment, just a moment, the canyon didn't seem so cold. The canyon was quiet again, but it was the kind of quiet that rang louder than any gunshot. The air felt thick with tension, as if every breath they took carried the weight of everything that had come before. Lila stood behind the rock with Jonah pressed close to her side, her heart still pounding in her chest. She could feel the heat of the sun on her back, but it was a distant warmth, like everything around her was frozen in place, waiting for the storm to hit. Ezekiel and Beck were on the move now, coordinating with the precision of men who had been in far too many fights to count. The sound of boots on rock echoed through the pass, their figures ghostly in the dimming light. Each step was deliberate, every motion calculated, as they prepared for the final showdown. Lila wasn't sure how long they had. Minutes, hours. It didn't matter. The fight was coming, and they weren't going to back down. The night was closing in faster than she expected. The canyon walls that had once felt like an impenetrable fortress now seemed to press in on them. tightening with each passing moment, as if it were too late to turn back. "You ready?" Beck's voice came low from behind her. Lila glanced back, his face shadowed, but his eyes sharp and steady. She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "Ready." Beside her, Ezekiel's face was a mirror of Beck's, calm, but with the quiet intensity of a man who had lived through too much to be anything but. His hand brushed against hers briefly, a silent promise of what they were about to face together. It wasn't much, but it was enough to steady her. The silence stretched for a long while before Caro's men began to move. The first crack of gunfire sounded like a thunderclap, and Lila's body reacted before her mind could catch up. She dropped low, pulling Jonah down with her as the echoes of battle filled the canyon. She could hear the sharp reports of rifles, the steady rhythm of returning fire, and the distant sounds of shouting. The men on the ridge were ready, though they didn't know what was coming for them. Beck fired first, his shot sharp and true, the force of it sending a man stumbling backward, clutching his shoulder. Ezekiel moved in sync, his own rifle finding its mark in the chaos, cutting down one of Caro's men who had begun to circle around the rock. Lila's breath came in short bursts. She had never been this close to real violence before, and yet, in some strange way, it felt almost like she had been living with it her entire life. Fear was nothing new to her. It was the price of survival. But as the shots rang out, as the dust rose like the breath of a dying world, she understood something deeper. This was no longer about running. It was about standing. The ground trembled beneath them as another barrage of shots flew from the ridge. One hit a nearby boulder, sending a spray of dust into the air. Lila ducked, her heart racing as the noise seemed to swallow them whole. "You're gonna have to move," Beck shouted over the chaos, his voice calm despite the danger surrounding them. "Now." Ezekiel didn't hesitate. He signaled to Lila and Jonah, "We move on my mark. Stay close." They moved quickly, dodging behind rocks and broken boulders, the world around them flashing with the speed of the battle. Each step they took was a calculated risk, but they were used to this kind of fear. It was the kind of fear that burned through your veins, pushed you beyond the limits you thought you had. A sharp cry came from above, the sound of a man falling, his voice fading as he hit the ground. Beck's gun smoked as he lowered it, his eyes never leaving the ridge. "Two down," he said, his voice low. "We're close." But the battle wasn't done. Caro's men were regrouping, and they were pushing harder now, sensing that the end was near. Lila could feel her pulse in her throat, her body on edge, waiting for the next shot to ring out. They were almost there, so close she could taste it. But the air seemed to thicken, each movement feeling slower, heavier. Another shot from above. Another man fell. But this time something was different. The men on the ridge weren't just fighting back. They were retreating. Lila's eyes flickered to Ezekiel. "They're pulling back." He nodded, his grip on his rifle steady, but there was something darker in his eyes. "Don't let your guard down. Not yet." Beck moved forward, his rifle raised. "We're not done yet. Caro won't give up that easily." Ezekiel's hand fell on Lila's shoulder, steadying her. "We keep moving, Lila. We don't stop until it's over." Lila nodded, and for the first time since this whole nightmare had started, she felt a surge of something she hadn't allowed herself to feel. Hope. But the moment was fleeting. A shadow shifted on the ridge, and suddenly, there was Caro. His figure emerged from behind the rocks, tall and imposing, his rifle aimed directly at them. Lila's breath caught in her chest. She knew this man. She had known him all her life. But this was different. There was no kindness in him now, no warmth. Just the cold calculation of a man who thought he could control everything. "Cole," Caro called, his voice carrying over the wind. "You think you can just walk away from me? After all I've done for you?" Ezekiel's grip on his rifle tightened. "You don't get to make demands anymore, Caro." Caro sneered, his finger curling around the trigger. "You should have stayed out of this, Ezekiel. You've made a mistake." "Not as big as yours," Ezekiel said, his voice steady. The air was thick with tension, as if the entire world was waiting for the first shot to be fired. But neither side moved. The canyon was silent for a heartbeat, the stillness hanging heavy in the air. And then it came. The crack of a rifle, the sharp report of gunfire. But it wasn't Ezekiel's. The shot rang true, and Caro's rifle fell from his hand, the man stumbling backward as he reached for his shoulder, blood already staining his shirt. Time 500. Lila's heart stopped for a moment. She knew who had fired. She didn't need to see the man to know. Beck Nolan. The fight had turned. Caro's men were falling back, retreating into the shadows, their leader wounded. It was over. The canyon had already shifted. The battle was won, but not without cost. Lila's hand shook as she stepped forward, her voice quiet. "Beck." He looked at her, his face grim, but his eyes held something soft, something like relief. "It's done," he said. Ezekiel stepped beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. "It's done," he repeated, his voice full of finality. For the first time in what felt like years, Lila felt something other than fear. The battle was over, but the war within her was just beginning. They had won. But the price had been steep.